The return of Wulfgar, her eyes narrowed, gauging the swell. She knew the calmest time was between tidal shifts. Above, the moon Nithelm hung motionless in the sky. Beside it, hurtling through the void though imperceptible to the human eye, its smaller sister Sadahelm edged closer. It was time. Princess Hildolith looked down to the wide, wise expanse of the Geofon. The sea, usually all heaving waves and shrieking wind, lay calm, for now. Long swells still rolled beneath the surface, but it was one of the rare moments the ocean seemed to rest. The best time to test the new device. She stepped back from the rail and descended the steep steps to the wide-open hatch of the engine room. A strange name, she thought, a room with an engine, aboard a ship. Peering into the shadowed depths, her eyes still half blinded by sunlight, she called out, "Ready." From below, the voice of the old runesmith echoed upward. "Furnace running hot, pressure gauge at optimum levels," he barked. "On your orders, lady." Hildolith climbed the steps back to the bridge. There stood Midshipman Sigabield, hands steady on the wheel, keeping the rudder firm. To one side, where once lay charts and sea runes, now stood a bristling nest of brass pipes, gauges, and ancient circuit boards scavenged from the junked relics of the great forge. Amid a mess of switches, levers, and strange humming wheels, the fresh-faced adept Edric looked up. "Ready," he said nervously. Hildolith tied the straps of her armor tight. All aboard wore full plate, even the youngest who sat at the new engine post. According to the old man, the last few attempts had ended in mild explosions. The ship itself, the Laot Bora, still bore the scorched scars of prior trials, so they all wore cataphracti armor cast in the great forge. The ancient machine built by their ancestors in long-forgotten times. She was Princess of NihtWyrtha. Her brother, King Ecbald, spent most of his days settling petty squabbles, land rights, oath feuds, old insults flaring anew. Here, honor was currency, and the worst thing a warrior could do was leave an oath unfulfilled. It was whispered, never spoken loudly, that those who broke sacred oaths or showed cowardice were hunted by the dreaded Hrafnfur, the Ravenfire. A spirit of terror, a nightmare passed from fire pit to cradle, stalking the long, cold nights of winter. The world itself moved through vast, slow cycles. The main island experienced twin seasons, Leotsummer, the long summer, when the sun reigned for half a year, and Leotnit, the long night, a half year of darkness. Between them came the Effenlang, the long dawn, a twilight of red and copper skies that lingered for a month. Even in darkness, beauty persisted. Effenleoma, the aurora, danced across the heavens, and the oceans shimmered with gaslioma, ghost lights born from phosphorescent algae. The people were seafarers, riding long, strong ships with banks of oars and tall sails. The seas were their roads. Mountains and the deep, wild forests made overland travel slow and perilous. Ship-to-ship combat was brutal and personal. Ramming and boarding were preferred over ranged warfare. Only darts flung from slings, or the rare electro-javelins, gave reach. They were a stoic folk, grim-humored in the face of tragedy. When ship captains saw the red horizon of Effenlang, they would declare themselves figward, doom-fated, and sail on into the storm, javelins crackling with spiteful electricity. Yet they were not mere barbarians. Ancient technology, half understood and often venerated as sorcery, provided smelting techniques, auspex scanners, atmospheric suits, and radar systems that could read the turning of the weather long before it arrived. Expeditions dove into the ocean depths, seeking the drowned cities of old. They relied on the Gasleoma's eerie glow, for lumen rods were scarce. Ascents were made with primitive bathyscaphia, submersibles dropped by cable to the seabed. If the light faded or cables snapped, the divers were lost, slipping into the Unkwom slop, the undeath sleep. They would remain there in silence until salvaged, or until their suits failed and the sea claimed them. The treasures buried beneath the waves were legendary. Some lords, occasionally kings, led expeditions to establish seabed colonies in the ruins, using ancient tunnels for warmth and air. Most of these outposts failed within weeks. Some flourished for decades. Towns beneath the waves, aglow with arcane life support systems from a vanished age. Floating ports were raised above them to hoist the bounty of forgotten empires into daylight. Yet they always failed, in the end. Pattern was the same. A colony announced a breakthrough, a deeper tunnel opened, deeper than any before. Then silence. When storms passed and rescue ships arrived, they found only drowned hulls and melted armor, and nothing else. Hildilith checked the auspex. Clear skies for now. But there, on the far rim of the scope, something. A storm front, perhaps 70 leagues off. She turned from the console, taking in the deck. The layout bora was ready. The ore decks were empty, sails stowed. Water and sand barrels were arrayed for fire control. The ship rode heavy in the water, heavier than any vessel before her. Not only was she the first ship to carry a steam engine, she was the first Ironside. Hildilith took a deep breath. This had been years in the making. She stood beside Siggebield, who swallowed hard and gripped the wheel with white-knuckled determination. "Fage a word," she commanded. The word hung in the air like a prayer or a curse. At first, nothing. Only the sound of wind brushing the rigging and the deep, restless breathing of the sea. She turned her eyes toward the iron funnel that jutted from the heart of the layout bora, a crooked chimney of scorched metal, streaked black from failed trials. From it, smoke billowed, dense and oily, curling into the sky like the breath of a dragon. The hiss of steam echoed beneath the deck, deep and rhythmic, like some slumbering beast stirring at last. All along the sides of the ship, the volunteers held tight to the railings, armor creaking, faces taut with anticipation. None spoke, not a word. Then, a shudder. A low groan ran through the timbers like the hull itself had drawn breath. Another hiss, louder now, followed by a deep, resonant chug that seemed to rise from the depths of the engine below. 2 knots, stated Edric from his tangle of pipes. The ship moved. At first, it was little more than a lurch, a hesitation as though the sea resisted. But then came the second chug, faster than the first, then a third, a fourth. The great wheel inside the engine spun with a rhythmic clatter, and the drive piston found its song. 8 knots, Edric said, excitement in his voice. With every beat, the Leobora surged forward, slicing the water with growing strength. Siggebield gripped the wheel tightly. He had to brace himself at the immense speed as the deck and wheel shook. Spray rose from the prow. The deck vibrated underfoot. Chains rattled, fittings strained, and above it all, the iron funnel screamed with pressure and heat. 12 knots! Shouted Edric over the noise. They were moving under power, faster than oars could carry her, faster than any sail had ever dared. The Leopbora rode low and heavy, but she flew, cutting across the water with growing momentum, each breath of steam feeding her hunger. Hildilith stepped out of the bridge, and Law, the Wigathane crew, holding on for their lives. But they were cheering. Nothing had ever moved at 12 knots before on NihtWyrtha. Not even a bird. Edric at his station pulled a lever to release overpressure, and shattering whale sound blasted from the vent alongside the funnel. Hildilith, laughing as the wind billowed through her hair, drew her javelin and held it high. Fageward! The weapon sparked, and others held up their own, lighting the air with electricity in celebration. Hildilith stood back beside Siggebield, the wind tearing at her cloak, the metal hull trembling beneath her feet. This was no longer a trial. This was history. Chaplain Drenak leaned closer to the viewport, scowling at the vast sea below. Nothing but endless water. It felt unnatural to him. Growing up on Medusa, this much open moisture wasn't just strange, it made him ill. The iron hands aboard the Questor Revelation had grown bored of orbit watch, so he, Apothecary Nathaniel, and Tech Marine Castor had descended for a closer look. Now, staring down at a seemingly endless ocean, Drenak wondered why he'd bothered. They stayed well away from the main island. They weren't ready to be seen, not yet. The last thing they wanted was to be surrounded by angry, frightened barbarians the moment they landed. Standard protocol for first contact involved approaching a remote outbuilding or hut and introducing themselves to a local, quietly. But this world had only one island. Landing unnoticed would be problematic. Castor stood at a side console, paying no attention to the view. A servo skull hovered nearby, projecting data lists and auspex readings into the air. There's only one primary landmass on Oceanus Orbium 35.281b, he said. Roughly 300 leagues from south to north, 50 across at the widest. To the south, jagged mountain peaks, natural breakwaters against the storm fronts. Lots of farmland behind them. He scrolled further. At the northernmost point, a massive mountain, almost always shrouded in cloud or rainfall. My guess, it acts as a bulwark against the worst tempests, handy for the natives. Drenak grunted. Is there anything nice about this fishbowl? Nathaniel, sitting at the shuttle controls, gave a cheerful laugh. Oh yes, Brother Chaplain. The island's heart is dominated by dense forests, colossal trees by the look of them. So thick they nearly divide the island in two. Makes overland travel a nightmare. Drenak rested his chin on his fist and slumped in quiet misery. Nathaniel went on. Because of that, the locals rely on large fleets of wooden-hulled ships. They use them to connect isolated settlements by sea, like veins and arteries. Castor picked up the thread. Satellite and servitor scans show floating platforms dotted along the coasts. Artificial farmland. Makes sense, considering how little arable land they have. They grow food on rafts. Drenak grunted again. And the power signatures Questa revelation detected? Castor brightened. Ah, yes. During the last storm, we picked up a void shield signature on the northern coast. The other is a fully functional STC manufactorum near the base of that big mountain I mentioned. Drenak's scowl deepened. So, brother, you're telling me these people have a standard template constructor and void shields, and they use wooden boats? One of them's using the shield as a bloody umbraculum? His tone was sharp, almost accusing. Castor gave a helpless shrug. Well, on a world covered in ocean, it is a pretty clever way to shield a port, and for all we know, the STC just makes really good shoes. Drenak snarled and slammed a gauntlet against the shuttle's inner hull, denting the plating. Nathaniel chuckled. If the shoes of Oceanus Orbi M35.281b become popular, we could name them after you. Drenak's. Has a nice ring. Drenak stared at the back of his head. Thank you, brother. I'll be sure to mention it to Lady Voretrix. Castor tried to suppress a laugh and turned back to his readings. The origin of the world-spanning ocean is a mystery to the Mechanicus. Same as the colony's founding. No records from Terra or Mars. But it's clear this planet was once not inundated. We've picked up signs of ancient highways, drowned riverbeds, city ruins. Submerged now, but they're there. Drenak let out a long, low sigh. His eyes drifted to the window again, and then he paused. His frown returned, but this time it wasn't frustration. You said the barbarians are pre-steam? Castor nodded, checking a parchment. Correct, typical pre-industrial society, nothing out of the ordinary. Drenak leaned forward, pointing towards something in the ocean below. So someone who could invent a steam engine here, that would make them a forward-thinking sort of fellow, yes? Nathaniel grinned. On this world, that'd make them the equivalent of an archmagos in status and learning. Castor followed Drenak's finger, narrowing his eyes as the shuttle shifted. Below them, slicing through the open sea, was a long, dark vessel, its sail furled, its ore decks empty. From behind its tall funnel, smoke curled into the sky. I think, Castor said, we just found an ideal first contact. Outsiders Hethrid clambered up the metal staircase, his father, the old runesmith, right behind him. Both were covered helm to boot in soot and charcoal dust. Edric helped them over the lip of the deck, earning a fresh coat of soot on his own armor. The three of them slapped backs and shook gauntleted hands. All around them, the Wigathane crew stood cheering, their voices rising above the hiss of steam and the gentle pitch of the sea. At the rail, Princess Hildolith leaned back with a wide, proud smile. Congratulations, Runesmith. Up on the bridge, Sigabild removed his helm and stood breathing hard, his fingers still twitching from the vibration of the wheel. He had only been part of the Navis Wellmare Wigathane for a month, and already he'd done the impossible. He had just piloted the first steam-powered Ironside, and he had gone faster than he thought the human body was capable of enduring. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the calm Geofon, still waiting for his heart to stop pounding. He could hardly believe what they had accomplished. Steam-powered ships, steam-powered Acer skip that could follow the summer around the world, growing food year-round. No hunger, no famine. Steam-powered Bathyscapium could make expeditions to the drowned cities easier. Who knew what treasures lay beneath the deeps? Even a steam-powered wagon, perhaps? On rails? Could such a thing cut through the dark forest and link both sides of the island? No, that was too fanciful. He smiled to himself, then paused. Far above, a raven wheeled in the sky. He frowned. What was it doing so far out over the sea? It wasn't one of theirs. He squinted, absently reaching for the oculus hanging from a hook on the bridge wall. Raising it to his eye, he focused on the strange-shaped bird, and his stomach dropped. Princess Hālgengas was still speaking, her voice ringing over the gathered crew. "You have just brought NihtWyrtha into a new age, the age of steam." Sigibild cleared his throat. Princess," he said, voice shaking. "I think NihtWyrtha is going to be a little more than the age of steam." She turned toward him, one brow raised. "How so?" she asked. Wordlessly, Sigibild handed her the oculus and nodded toward the sky. "The age of whatever motive force can make a ship fly in the air." Hālgengas raised the lens and peered upward. She spotted the Raven and saw it for what it truly was. A ship made of metal flying in the sky like a bird. Outsiders. She lowered the oculus slowly, her expression calm. "Just so," she said softly. Then she raised her voice, clear and commanding. "Make ready. We are about to meet outsiders." First impressions. Chaplain Drenak clipped his helm into place as he made ready. Brother Castor gave him a firm look. "You're going to wear that for your first meeting?" "Why not? It's my badge of office," said Drenak. Brother Nathaniel shook his head. "Your helm is a skull face. Do you think that gives the right impression?" Drenak turned his skull-helmed head to face him, green eye lenses glowing softly. "Why wouldn't it?" Castor sighed. "Never mind." He tapped the Vox. "Tiberius, we are in position." High in orbit aboard the Questa Revelation, Magos Ductora Cogitatis, Tiberius sat upon the ship's command throne, surrounded by swirling hololiths. He had tapped into all 7 of the ship's long-range telescopes and every servitor-operated sensor whisker. Beside him stood Archmagos Pyravox of Incoloris Hive World, reviewing the streaming data feeds. Opposite him, Archmagos Damia Voratrix sat awkwardly on a vacant weapon-seer chair, her snake-like lower half coiled beneath her. She usually required a custom platform, but this once she made do. She nodded to Tiberius. Tiberius spoke into the Vox. "Go ahead and make contact." Pyravox raised one of his 6 spindly fingers. I had a thought." They all turned toward him. Tiberius with interest, Voratrix with irritation. Pyravox gestured to the shuttle's internal hololith. "Wouldn't Chaplain Drenek's skull mask be a little disconcerting to a techno-barbarian?" they considered. Tiberius wasn't sure what normal humans expected to see. After all, didn't all humans use skulls? Servo skulls were everywhere. Skulls as decoration, skulls on armor, skulls as sacred symbols. Skulls were comforting. Not as good as cogs, of course, but acceptable. Voratrix, who had replaced her own skull some time ago due to inconvenience, quietly thought Pyravox had a point, but she would never admit it. "Too late now," she muttered. Then, after a moment's pause, she added, "Could it be much worse than Drenak's real face?" She shrugged, then conceded, "Castor and Nathaniel shouldn't wear their helms." Tiberius frowned. "But what if the barbarians attack them?" Voratrix nodded. "It could happen, but I doubt a javelin is much to worry about." Quietly, she sent a data signal to her forge adepts to begin designing a female facial covering for herself. Something more realistic, with synth skin. First impressions mattered. On the shuttle deck, the reply came through. "Proceed at your own discretion. Techmarine Castor and Apothecary Nathaniel, you are advised to refrain from wearing helms." Castor maglocked his helmet and muttered, "The new spheric interfacing unit better work. I don't want to be using sign language to explain where we came from." "The interfacing unit will work fine," Voratrix replied across the link, with a tone of hope more than certainty. The shuttle hovered in perfect synchrony beside the Leopora, servitor cogitators keeping the crafts aligned with uncanny precision. With a hiss, the shuttle doors opened. Drenak marched down the ramp onto the wooden deck, Castor and Nathaniel flanking him. Before them stood a woman in full battle armor, flanked by warriors of similar build, each holding a long javelin at the ready. All of them, these supposed techno-barbarians, were clad in something startlingly familiar. Castor whispered, "That's cataphractii." Nathaniel shook his head. "Looks nothing like Terminator armor." "It does," Drenak said, gaze fixed ahead. "It's old, like the designs used in the Great Crusade, over 5 millennia old. There's a set of it in the Chapel Museum on Medusa." Castor scanned the faces of the warriors. "They don't look afraid." The armored warriors remained silent, their eyes locked on Drenak's skull mask. The woman stepped forward, not with fear but with a small, confident smile. She stopped before Drenak, met his glowing gaze without hesitation, and slammed the haft of her javelin into the deck. It stood upright, quivering slightly. She looked into the cold green lenses of his helm without a flicker of doubt. "Greetings, Lord Wulfgar," she said, giving him a nod. "Wulfgar returns." Of all the things Princess Hildilith had expected to see emerge from the flying ironclad, she could not have prepared herself for what she saw. It had long been debated among the scholars of NihtWyrtha that the planet's moon, Nithhelm, might hold men upon its surface. Through the oculus, one could see the faintest outline of structure, fortress walls, the angles of great buildings. There had never been any sign of movement, no firelight or ships, but it stood to reason. Someone must have built those strongholds. And who else but men? So it was only natural in her mind that the visitors would come from the moon. An adventurer, perhaps, a lone wanderer or envoy of that hidden people. Instead, she watched the ramp clang down and strike the deck of her ship, and saw Wulfgar, the father of knowledge, descend into view. Her breath caught in her throat. It made complete sense. It was Wulfgar, after all, who legend told had inscribed protective runes on newly forged items, and so of course, a new steam engine, the first of its kind, would draw him forth to bestow his blessing. The figure beside him must be Osric, the patron runesmith of old, returned from the high forges of the heavens. Clearly the Hlaford Geofonward, the Lord Guardian of Heaven, had sent these men to congratulate her, her crew, and her people. Drenak was taken aback for a moment. One who was always eloquent and quick with words, he now struggled with what she had called him. Wulfgar? Who or what was Wulfgar? Had Logis Lex Mechanic Cognis made a mistake? Was the new spheric interfacing unit failing to translate? Princess Hildilith looked uncertain now. She glanced at Castor, then pointed toward the sky. "Are you from Nithhelm?" she asked, gesturing to the moon above. Its smaller sister, Siduhelm, was already drifting further, racing ahead in its tighter orbit. Castor followed her gaze, then shook his head slowly. "Sorry, we explored the ruins on your moon, Nithhelm. What we found were signs of ancient devastation. Fortress structures shattered, battle debris scattered across the dust. The dead are long gone, desiccated into dust, fallen warriors from a war that may predate even the Imperium." He took a step forward, voice calm but curious. "I don't suppose... You know what happened up there? The lower passageways are clawed, massive gashes down armored corridors, 3-foot-thick plasteel doors torn open by something with talons." He held out his hands. "We were wondering, what kind of foe could do such a thing?" Hildilith's eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat. "No," she said softly. "We always hoped that there were still men there." Nathaniel, who had been scanning the gathered warriors with his auspex, turned to Drenak with a note of surprise in his voice. "Something interesting, Brother Chaplain. These people, they have the Susan membrane." Drenak looked from the apothecary to the princess. That autonomic function, the ability to enter a deathless coma-like state during trauma or deprivation, was a feature of space marine physiology. To find it naturally occurring in an unaltered human population was remarkable, unheard of. Nathaniel stepped forward gently. "Princess, when your people fall ill or are gravely wounded, do they enter a sleep-like state, cocooned, as if, waiting?" Hildilith nodded with a soft smile. "We call it unquilm slop, the unwakeable sleep. Don't all humans have this?" Castor moved toward the soot-covered runesmith, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Greetings. I'm Castor Tech Marine of the Iron Hands Astartes. We saw your ship at full steam. How did you reach that temperature? The pressure, the efficiency, it was beautifully controlled. Tell me everything." Off to the side, Siggebield and Edric watched with quiet wonder. Siggebield murmured, "I think the princess was right. We are entering a new era." Edric nodded, eyes locked on the shuttle, its smooth metal hull, aerodynamic wings like a raven's, the soft hum of its grav engines holding it suspended in place. Then he looked up to the darkening sky. "I wonder what their void ironclads look like, and how they work." Drenak watched as Castor drifted away with some of the NihtWyrthan warriors deep in conversation. Nathaniel was already sketching diagrams in the soot with one of the engineers. For a moment the chaplain stood silent, taking it all in. Then at last, he found his voice. "We are from the Imperium of Man. We bring you greetings, and we would like to officially make contact with your world." Hildolith gave him a wide smile. I have a few ideas, she said. Above them, the aphenlioma began to light up the sky in green curtains of light, while the Geofon itself was lit by ghastlioma. In the distance, the towering mountain of the Holmbiorg drifted on the horizon. From late on into the setting light, as the Leotbora drifted on the green Geofon sea, the people of two very different worlds talked and plotted. This was a new chapter in the history of NihtWyrtha, and its first tentative steps towards the foundation of the Void Revenants. Although at the time, no one could have guessed it.